By the 70s and 80s, Republican strategists wanted realignment. Liberals had control of the Congress, presidency, and the Supreme Court for 3 decades. Republicans wanted to take the government back. If the same party controls both the Senate and the House and the presidency, that party has incredible power. The president will most likely be able to complete most of his agenda. The opposite party's proposals will likely not be scheduled for hearing or even discussed. Bush grew up in a wealthy home in Texas, where his father was a successful oilman, and he was raised around conservative values from an early age. He grew up to believe that voluntary organizations, church charities, and individualism could solve most social problems. He also thought that the 1960s had corrupted American values by sparking the drug culture, liberal ideology, and secularism. Bush was an alcoholic periodically from. Some of Bush's ambitious goals included returning the U.S. to the values and policies of the late 19th century when churches dominated social welfare. Bush believed that God intended him to restore traditional Christian values into America. He wanted to move the nation in a more conservative direction. He also wanted to downsize the federal government and turn many programs from the federal government's responsibility. Almost 40% of the tax cut would benefit the wealthiest 1% of the U.S. The tax cut was enacted, but it was reduced to $1.35 trillion. Bush invested far more political resources in his tax cut than he did any other domestic policy in his first 3 years of presidency. This tax cut would increase economic inequality even further. On September 11, 2001, 2 hijacked planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Another crashed into the Pentagon, and a 4th plane was on track to strike either the White House or the Capitol building, but instead crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. This terrorist act was conducted by Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden ran to Afghanistan, where he was protected by the Taliban. Bush declared a war on terrorism, and Congress gave Bush the clear to attack and defeat the Taliban. Bush's educational proposal, titled No Child Left Behind Act, was enacted in January 2002. This increased federal subsidies to schools by $11 billion and required states to either use existing standardized tests or develop them. If school scores failed to improve, the school would be put on notice by the state. If they continued to show no improvement, these schools might be shut down. Critics feared that teachers would teach to test rather than enhancing. There was no apparent reason why Bush focused on Iraq in mid-2002. There was no evidence that had surfaced that linked Hussein to Al-Qaeda. The UN supposedly had found weapons of mass destruction before being kicked out of Iraq. Iraq remained a weak nation from strict trade sanctions placed on the UN after Desert Storm, and many children were starving because Iraq lacked proper. So why did Bush wage a war on Iraq then? Well, the short answer is for political reasons. Congressional elections were coming up and Republican prospects were declining. Bush wanted to seem like the hero of the country by creating a threat to the U.S. even when there wasn't one. Saddam Hussein hired assassins to kill George H.W. Bush, George Bush's father, in the late 1990s, but they were unsuccessful. He wanted to get back at them. Preemptive strikes. The new foreign policy issued in September 2002 said, "While the United States will constantly strive to enlist the support of the international community, we will not hesitate to act alone, if necessary, to exercise our right of self-defense by acting preemptively against such terrorists." But wouldn't other nations initiate action against countries that they suspect might attack them? Hussein was vague about whether or not he destroyed previously discovered weapons of mass destruction. Bush then shifted the agenda from the economy and domestic problems to Iraq. Inspectors couldn't find any weapons of mass destruction, so Bush insisted that Hussein's refusal to account for his weapons meant that he had them. Criticism of Bush's decision escalated not only in the U.S. but all around the world. Colin Powell testified in front of the domestic agenda in 2003 and 2004. There was a proposed additional $700 billion multi-year tax cut, which liberal critics argued it would only benefit the nation's top 10% wealthiest individuals and that it would lead to huge deficits. Bush had tax cuts by almost $1.7 trillion spread over 10 years. Effects of the Iraq War. The Iraq War swayed voters in the 2006 congressional elections. Additionally, voters' perceptions of the Iraq War would then determine the 2008 elections for presidency. More Democrats were in tune with the adverse public opinion about the Iraq War than were the Republicans.